Welcome to the 20th anniversary of the Nygren Wetland Preserve. My name is Carrie Lee, and I'm the Executive Director of the Natural Land Institute since 2013. The Nygren Wetland was established in the year 2000. We are going to share with you the 20-year story of how this Nygren Wetland Preserve has come to be, from Dave Clutter putting together all the partnerships to be able to purchase the preserve with Ed Sterling. And then when Jerry Paulson came in 2000, he began with his specialty in restoration ecology to begin to pull together the incredible story of the restoration of this preserve. We are also honored to acknowledge that the Nygren Wetland Preserve is the ancestral land of the Sac and the Fox and other tribal groups who all trace their heritage to this region and who are now a part of the Ho-Chunk Nation.
The story of the Nygren Wetland Preserve begins when Carl Nygren died and left, through his will, all of his money, stocks and bonds, his home, and all of his worldly possessions to the Natural Land Institute with the stipulation that the money be used to acquire and create a wildlife sanctuary in Winnebago County. After Carl Nygren died and the money came to the Natural Land Institute, they started a process to identify land to acquire.
We had a gift just come over the transom. Carl Nygren had left his estate to the Natural Land Institute. Mark Keister was the director of Winnebago County Forest Preserve District at that time, and Mark reached out to Ed Sterling, our executive director, and myself, and he said, you know, I have this landowner, his name is Horst Lesser, and Horst is interested in selling, you know, a portion of his farm. And he said it's, you know, restorable. And so we all got together and we talked with Horst. And at that time, Horst was wanting to sell the southeast field, sort of the confluence, because I think it had been flooding. Timing was pretty amazing on this project, because at the same time we were involved in the Blufflands Alliance, which is a 4-state consortium of conservation organizations, land trusts, working to protect the bluffs of the Mississippi River. And Mark Ackelson was the executive director of Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation at that time. And Mark had said during this meeting that through the new Farm Bill, there is a lot of money through the Wetlands Reserve Program. And he said, I think his quote was, "The spigot is open, so get after it." I immediately set a meeting with NRCS and Ed Johnston. Ed was wonderful, and you know, he took the time to sort of sit down with me and go over the map. And it turns out that the entire property qualified for a Wetlands Reserve Program easement. So now we were looking at the prospects of $982,000 coming through NRCS. So, you know, immediately I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, instead of buying one field or the other, you know, we could potentially buy this whole property. A $2.1 million acquisition was a big acquisition, and there's a lot of uncertainty, you know, involved in something like that. And of course, I was 27 at the time and fearless, and thought, let's do this thing. But I think, you know, Ed was a little more grounded and sort of understood the risks, and you know, he was the executive director. And but I think, you know, through the process of, you know, working with partners and really laying out a plan, you know, ultimately we decided to go for it. Taking on a project like the Nygren acquisition and this big restoration project was definitely a departure from what we had focused on in the past. So, you know, starting back with George Fell, the first executive director of Nature Conservancy and the founder of the Natural Land Institute, there was this historic focus on high quality natural areas. There was really an opportunity to look at, you know, things like ecosystem services. You know, how does this then, if we take that riparian land out of production, you know, that's ultimately going to have a benefit for water quality, because we're not going to have that soil running into the rivers. You know, the habitat, just the amount of acreage and habitat that we could provide for, you know, grassland birds and other wildlife, you know, was fantastic. And also at the time we were thinking, you know, this could really potentially be a project where we could engage the public, we could raise the profile of the organization. A lot of land trusts today would call this property an ambassador property.
The first thing we did was we looked at historical documentation. So we looked at the original land survey records from the 1800s, looked at the 1937, I believe it was, aerial photograph, actually interviewed some of the neighboring landowners, including the landowner of this property, tried to understand history, looked at the history of Raccoon Creek that comes from Wisconsin, just west of Beloit, Wisconsin, and then meanders down, ultimately going right through the Nygren property. So we looked at the historic records associated with various dams and mills, grist mills that were placed on Raccoon Creek, tried to understand the changes in hydrology that occurred, and then also looked at the history of the Pecatonica River, water control on the Rock River and Sugar River to understand regional hydrology change. And then on this property itself, we looked at the drainage infrastructure where ditches and tiles and culverts and dredging and channelization and berms and dikes and all sorts of other features, including railroad berms, were placed. The types of habitat we found were, ran the gamut from small remnant oak savanna areas that had the typical disturbances, shade suppression from invasive shrubs, ground story system collapsed because of shade, heavy deer browsing in some locations that was also contributing to the collapse of the ground story, to wetland systems that were dominated nearly entirely by reed canary grass, Southeast Asian reed canary grass, some areas with Phragmites, some of the key invasive species that are omnipresent in the Pecatonica Basin were present on the property. Some small patches of remnant sedge meadow and wet prairie. Wonderful blank slate because of drained hydric soils, historic wetland soils that were present that still retain some seed bank, some native species seeds and tubers and bulbs and turions and rhizomes and spores, that if the agricultural conditions that was maintaining the crops, the drainage and the tillage could cease, we could revitalize, restore, and reinvigorate those seed banks. Property lines matter, and we could do something on our side of the property line, but not surcharge water, increase flooding upstream or downstream. So the details really matter, and that all along the way, the aspirational thinking was challenged by what could and couldn't be done.
This was something where partnerships, was absolutely critical. And there were issues of timing because Horst at that time, when I pitched the idea to him that, we'd like to contemplate buying the whole farm, he thought, okay, he'd consider that, and he came back and said, I'd be willing to do that, but I don't want to piece this thing out. I just want to get it done, and that's it. That's the only way I'll do it. So it was really a process of working with funders, but also working with partners like the Conservation Fund, which was really a critical partner in the acquisition. We knew we could get C2000 money, we knew we could probably get Grand Victoria money, we knew we could pull together the funding sources, but the timing was off, so there had to be a sequencing there. So I reached out to my colleague and mentor at that time, Peg Coring with the Conservation Fund, and we were having this conversation, and I was laying out the deal, and I said, we need another partner. But there was a pause on the phone, and she said, well, why don't you ask me? And I said, okay, Peg, would you help with this acquisition project? And she said, yes, I will. So the Conservation Fund, I think, had been working with Doris Duke Foundation on getting the revolving fund established. So they used funding out of their revolving fund to purchase this. But still, we needed to have Horst Lesser put the Wetlands Reserve Program easement on the property first, prior to the sale. And of course, from Horst's perspective, he didn't want to put the WRP easement on the property and then we back out. And now he's stuck with this easement and with this restoration project. So we needed to do this simultaneous closing. So we needed to basically link these, link the NRCS easement with the acquisition through the Conservation Fund. So we got that part done, and then it was just really a function of, pulling the funding sources together. I remember, Jill Knay and Sue Merchant were very important and helpful on the 2 grant proposals through Grand Victoria Foundation and C2000. And, within, I think, a year and I can't remember exactly, a year and a half, we had put the money together then to buy the property back from the Conservation Fund.
This project was ambitious for NLI, and it was a leap of faith for our Board of Trustees to approve. Gordon Eggers was our president from '97 through '99, and at the February 11th, 1999 board meeting, when the total assets for NLI were $1.7 million and we had a staff of 4, the board approved the $2.2 million purchase of the Carl and Myrna Nygren Wetland Preserve. Gordon and Lee Johnson, who was another NLI board member and executor of Carl Nygren's estate, and our director Ed Sterling and other staff did site visits for potential properties and met with foundations and potential granting agencies. And after he was president, Gordon focused on chairing the development committee and led the successful capital campaign. Even with the grants we received, NLI relied on private contributions for much of the restoration work. Randy Vincent stepped up as president in April of 1999 for 3 years, during the purchase of the land from the Conservation Fund on June 30th, 2000, and during the early phases of restoration. Russ Johansson was our treasurer throughout the entire process. Bruce Ross Shannon did all the legal work for this complicated project. The contracts, the purchase agreements, the deeds, the easements, this entire binder, and all at no cost to NLI. It really took Bruce to make all the pieces of this puzzle fit together. This project proves how important legacy gifts are. Carl Nygren would be thrilled to see all the land and wildlife his life's work has protected.
Rockton Township was also a key player. And Jack Cook was on our board at that time, and Jack was very animated about this. Actually, Rockton Township helped with the acquisition, and their role was really helping to acquire that platted subdivision. So right now when you drive in and you have that parking area with the overlook, that was part of the platted subdivision, and Rockton Township and Jack was really critical in making that happen. It was a very exciting project. But that was just the beginning, and now it was really thinking about the restoration. So we had some money left over. We had invested the Nygren money, and that had grown considerably, so we had some money left over that we put toward the restoration, and then we had NRCS monies that we put toward the restoration. And then in the meantime, we were writing additional C2000 grants, grant proposals and others to get additional funding for the restoration. At that time, Jerry Paulson had come in as our executive director, and that was Jerry's specialty. So we couldn't have had a better person at the helm than Jerry to lead that project forward in the big restoration.
So when NLI acquired the property, there were still a few small remnants of prairie along the old railroad right-of-way and down in some of the wetter areas, and remnants of the oak forest. But otherwise, everything had to be recreated. First of all, the drainage ditches were removed or plugged up, and that restored the water to the wetlands. The uplands were seeded with a drill and with seed that was purchased from a local seed nursery, and with lots and lots of volunteers who collected seeds from the remnants here and nearby and came out and scattered the seeds. Plus, volunteers grew about 50,000 seedlings that year in a greenhouse. The following spring, they planted them out in what has now become the Meyer wildflower garden. And then those plants, as they matured and set seed, were used for collecting additional seed to plant in the wetlands. In addition, where it used to be forests, we came in and put in thousands of tree seedlings in some areas, and then we actually seeded in acorns and walnuts and other tree seeds into some areas and got them started that way. So it was a major effort. Out of the 700 acres, about 500 were actually restored and reseeded.
I remember early out at Nygren, we were told that we were going to put Raccoon Creek back in its original channel. You could still see the channel in through the little wooded area. So we'd spent the winter before cutting down a lot of trees, cleaning up the channel. Then when it got on to springtime, one Wednesday we were out volunteering and we were told that they were about to bring the last remaining barrier for Raccoon Creek back so that it would go back in its original channel. So we all ran down there real quick, and sure enough, here comes the water. And it was quite a thrill just to see that that was coming back into where it was supposed to be in the start.
I find it a really rewarding experience. Spend a lot of time outside, and it's usually, it's a learning project too. At the same time, I'm learning more about plants, birds, and things of that nature than I ever really knew before. The fact that they see the change since I started there at the wetlands, how many things have gotten better, and wildlife there, it's really something worthwhile to see, to been part of something of that happening.
Being outdoors, working outside, I've never done that before, and Nygren provides that opportunity, but also the people, two groups. The guys we volunteer with have been really fun over the years, and the bosses have been good. I've learned so much about plants and birds, and I would want to thank, and the rest of the volunteers want to thank whoever donated the new chainsaws, the new lawnmower, the new ATVs, the new truck, etc. Makes the work so much easier.
I want to say thank you to all of our donors and to acknowledge the incredible intensive effort that has taken over the last 20 years to make the Nygren Wetland Preserve what it is today. Doesn't mean we still don't have a lot of work to do. And as Lee Bach said in his words to you, how appreciative we are to all of the funders and to you, the donors, ongoing work, and the importance of the Eggers Fund for the future of the Nygren Wetland Preserve. The future of the Nygren Wetland Preserve will be to be doing continued ongoing restoration to make sure that the functions of this preserve are constantly improving, and that functioning also as an ambassador to our communities, to all of the high school students who come and use this with their science classes, and to all of the people who find inspiration volunteering here and acknowledging how important this preserve is. And as we move into the future with our Raccoon Creek plan, as we look towards how we can protect this as part of a larger ecological complex all up and down the Raccoon Creek, we are grateful to you and look forward to another awesome 20 years. Thank you.